6 countries, 1 night, 1 plan. Historian Professor Amadou Diarra arrived with old maps. Ibrahim Traoré asked curiously, "Professor, why are these maps important?"
Mr.
President, a secret agreement signed in 1964 outlines how 6 West African countries would be controlled using the same methods. Diarra showed the document, coup in Mali, chaos in Niger, civil war in Chad, all on the same night. Traoré asked in amazement, "And is this plan still active?"
Mr.
President, according to the document, it was supposed to continue for 60 years. And the time is running out. January 17, 2025, Burkina Faso Presidential Palace. When Ibrahim Traoré arrived at his office for his usual morning briefing, there was an unexpected visitor waiting at his desk. Professor Amadou Diarra was one of the country's most respected historians and normally wouldn't come to the presidential palace outside of academic meetings. But this morning, he sat across from Traoré with old maps and yellowed documents in his hands. "Professor Diarra," said Traoré, "your presence here before the morning briefing is very unusual. Is there something very important?" Professor Diarra, 67 years old, looked at Traoré from behind his glasses. His face showed both excitement and concern.
Mr. President, I couldn't sleep last night.
The documents I found 48 hours ago are so shocking that I had to share them with you immediately. Traoré focused his attention. Professor Diarra had been researching African history for the last 40 years, and coming with such urgency indicated an important discovery. "Why are these maps important, Professor?" Diarra spread an old map on the table. The map appeared to be from 1964 and showed West Africa. 6 countries were marked with different colors: Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso.
Mr.
President, this map is an appendix to a highly classified agreement signed in Paris in 1964. This agreement details how 6 West African countries would be controlled for 60 years. Traoré leaned over the map. There were notes next to each country, written in French. "What do these notes say, Professor?" Mali, control through coup, military administration preferred. Niger, internal chaos to be created, weak civilian governments supported. Chad, continuous civil war, tribal conflicts to be fueled. Senegal, economic dependence, political manipulation. Mauritania, instability using slavery issues. Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, frequent government changes, military interventions.
Traoré stood up, amazed.
"Professor, where do these documents come from?"
Mr.
President, from the old archives of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A French historian friend of mine came across these documents while researching African colonialism. They've been kept secret for 60 years because they were highly classified. When he opened the second document, Traoré was even more shocked. This document contained dates. Very specific dates. August 15, 1964, coup in Mali December 18, 1965, chaos in Niger April 13, 1966, conflict to be initiated in Chad January 2, 1966, government change in Upper Volta. "Professor, do these dates match real events?"
Professor Diarra nodded. Mr.
President, when I compared these dates with African history, there's a perfect match. There was a military coup in Mali exactly on August 15, 1964. Major protests and chaos began in Niger on December 18, 1965. This cannot be coincidence. Definitely not coincidence, Mr.
President.
These documents are proof of a 60-year plan. The third document was the most shocking. Titled Operation Sahel Control, 60-Year Master Plan, this document outlined plans for each country in 10-year periods. 1964 to 1974, first period establishment of military control 1974 to 1984, second period increase of economic dependence 1984 to 1994, third period manipulation of civilian governments 1994 to 2004, fourth period forced integration with globalization 2004 to 2014, fifth period intervention under the pretext of fighting terrorism 2014 to 2024, sixth period final stage, permanent control. As Traoré read the document, he understood why Africa's last 60 years had been in constant turmoil. "Professor, this means that all the coups we experienced, all the civil wars, all the instability was planned?" "Unfortunately, it appears so, Mr.
President.
And the most frightening part is that the plan ends in 2024.
This year.
So what happens after 2024? Professor Diarra opened the last document. This was the most disturbing one. Post-2024 Plan, Permanent Integration. This document contained permanent integration plans for post-2024. The complete transfer of 6 countries to French control, their loss of independence, essentially making them colonies again, was planned.
Mr.
President, according to this document, at the end of 2024, 6 countries will voluntarily transfer part of their sovereignty to France. How is this possible? According to the document, economic crises, security threats, and social unrest will be created. Then France will come as a savior and take control in exchange for aid. Traoré was beginning to grasp the magnitude of the plan. For 60 years, this region of Africa had been systematically weakened, destabilized, and prepared to be completely taken over. Professor, is there a section about this plan regarding other countries?
Mr.
President, there are special strategies for each country. Military leadership tolerance for Mali, uranium dependency for Niger, oil diplomacy for Chad. What does it say for us? Professor Diarra turned the page. Burkina Faso, control of gold resources, frequent leadership changes, preservation of French military base. And what does it say about our current situation?
Mr.
President, your name appears in the 2024 plan. It says Ibrahim Traoré high risk factor, off-plan development, urgent intervention required. This information made Traoré think deeply. So the independence decisions he had made over the last 2 years had disrupted the 60-year plan. Professor, if these documents are true, are the leaders of the other 5 countries aware of this situation?
I don't think so, Mr. President.
These documents are kept highly secret. Most African leaders don't even know how their countries are being manipulated. Then we need to warn them. Professor Diarra looked concerned.
Mr.
President, this is very risky. Revealing these documents could lead to very big reactions. But Professor, we're in the final year of the 60-year plan. If we don't act, 6 countries will be completely lost. Traoré immediately called an urgent meeting. Foreign Minister Olivier Ruamba, Intelligence Chief Colonel Sankara, and Security Advisor Dr. Aminata Kone attended the meeting. Friends, said Traoré, the information I just learned could change Africa's future. The documents were spread on the table. Each participant examined the documents in turn. The amazement on their faces grew increasingly.
Mr.
President, said Colonel Sankara, if these documents are true, not just us, but the entire region is in danger.
Yes, Sankara.
And we must stop this plan.
Foreign Minister Ruamba, Mr.
President, how will we reach other countries? These documents are very sensitive. Olivia, we'll use secret diplomatic channels. We already have close relations with Mali and Niger. We can also reach Chad, Senegal, and Mauritania.
Dr.
Kone emphasized an important point, Mr. President, we must be very careful when sharing these documents. If France learns that this plan has been exposed, they might activate emergency action plans. The next day, secret diplomatic contacts began. A conversation was held with Mali President Dembélé over a secure line. Assimi, said Traoré, I need to show you very important documents. We've been part of a 60-year plan. Dembélé was surprised. What kind of plan, Ibrahim? A plan for systematic control of 6 countries. You, me, Tiani. We're all targets of this plan. Documents were sent to Mali. Dembélé's reaction was as expected, shock and anger. Ibrahim, if these documents are true, we've been used like toys for 60 years. Tiani's reaction from Niger was even harsher. Those who made this plan have seen our countries as laboratory rats. The conversation with Chad President Devi was more challenging. Chad had very close relations with France. Ibrahim, said Devi cautiously, these documents contain very serious accusations. Mahamat, the documents prove historical facts. All the civil wars experienced in Chad were part of this plan. Senegal President Sall was the most skeptical. Ibrahim, these documents could be manipulation. Fake documents produced to target France. Macky, you can verify the authenticity of the documents. You can also compare them with historical facts. Mauritania President Ghazouani took the most pragmatic approach. Ibrahim, even if the documents are true, stopping this plan is very risky. However, by the end of the week, all 6 leaders had been convinced of the authenticity of the documents. Comparison with historical events proved that the plan was real. Following this discovery, the 6 country leaders decided to meet for a secret summit. The meeting location was determined to be Dakar, Senegal. On January 25, 2025, 6 leaders met in Dakar. The meeting was kept so secret that even press members were unaware. "Friends," said Traoré opening the meeting, "today could be the day a 60-year plan comes to an end." Dembele from Mali, Ibrahim, "These documents show us that our independence was fake. Real control has always been with others." Tiani from Niger, "We've been played like puppets for 60 years. Devi from Chad, "So what do we do now? How do we stop this plan?" Saul from Senegal, "The most important issue is whether we share this information with the public." Gazouani from Mauritania, "If we reveal these documents, it will cause a very big international crisis." Traoré stood up, "Friends, we've been silenced for 60 years. It's time to tell the truth." At the end of the meeting, the 6 leaders made a joint decision. The documents would be shared with the international public and the 60-year plan would be officially terminated. On February 1, 2025, 6 countries held press conferences simultaneously. World media was amazed by this synchronized announcement. Traoré in Ouagadougou, Dembele in Bamako, Tiani in Niamey revealed the documents at the same time. "For 60 years, our countries have been part of a secret plan," said Traoré. "These documents show how we were systematically weakened." International reaction was huge. France claimed the documents were fake and manipulative. But when the documents were examined by international experts, they were confirmed to be original. Following this announcement, 6 countries opened a new page. The Sahel Independence Pact was signed. In this pact, 6 countries declared their real independence and announced that they rejected all kinds of external intervention. 3 months later, an investigation commission was established in the European Parliament. The documents were also confirmed by the Parliament. 6 months later, the French president had to make an apology statement. "We made mistakes in our Africa policies in the past." 1 year later, the 60-year plan had completely ended. 6 countries had become truly independent. The documents found by Professor Diarra had not only illuminated the past but also changed the future. And Ibrahim Traoré went down in history as the leader who broke the 60-year plan. Every January 25 began to be celebrated as Sahel Liberation Day. 6 countries had not risen up on the same night. They had been liberated on the same night. The revelation of the secret agreement had profound implications that extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. The systematic nature of the 60-year plan revealed the sophisticated mechanisms through which former colonial powers had maintained control over their former colonies long after formal independence. The documents uncovered by Professor Diarra represented one of the most comprehensive examples of neo-colonial planning ever discovered. Unlike the crude territorial control of the colonial era, this plan demonstrated how psychological manipulation, economic dependency, and political interference could achieve the same results as military occupation while maintaining the fiction of sovereignty. The academic community's response to the document revelations was immediate and intense. Universities across Africa and Europe began comprehensive research projects to verify the claims and examine similar patterns in other regions. The University of Dakar established a special research center dedicated to studying neo-colonial control mechanisms, while the Sorbonne faced uncomfortable questions about its own role in training the administrators who had implemented these policies. International legal scholars were particularly fascinated by the implications for international law. The documents appeared to show systematic violations of a United Nations Charter and various treaties regarding state sovereignty. Legal proceedings were initiated at the International Court of Justice, though these would take years to resolve. The psychological impact on African populations was enormous. For generations, Africans had been told that their country's problems were due to internal failings, tribal conflicts, corruption, inability to manage modern states. The revelation that many of these problems had been deliberately created or exacerbated by external powers led to a fundamental shift in African consciousness. The economic analysis of the plan revealed the staggering scope of wealth extraction that had occurred. Economic historians calculated that the systematic underpayment for African resources, combined with inflated prices for imported goods and services, had transferred approximately $2.5 trillion from the 6 countries to France over the 60-year period. This represented roughly 10 times the total aid that France had provided to these countries during the same period. The technological dimensions of the control plan were particularly sophisticated. The documents revealed how French advisors had deliberately designed infrastructure systems that created dependency rather than self-sufficiency. Telecommunications networks, transportation systems, and even educational curricula had been structured to reinforce connections to France while making inter-African connections difficult. The revelation also exposed the extent to which international organizations had been co-opted into the control system. Documents showed how World Bank and IMF policies had been coordinated with French objectives, ensuring that structural adjustment programs reinforced rather than challenged the dependency relationships. The media warfare that accompanied the document revelations was intense. French and European media outlets initially dismissed the documents as forgeries or anti-Western propaganda. However, the authentication process conducted by multiple independent experts from various countries made this position increasingly untenable. Alternative media networks, particularly those funded by China and Russia, extensively covered the story and used it to challenge Western narratives about development and democracy in Africa. This created a complex information environment where the same facts were interpreted very differently depending on the source. The diplomatic consequences extended far beyond Africa and France. Other former colonial powers found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their own relationships with former colonies. Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and other European countries began receiving requests from African governments for access to their own classified archives. The revelation also had significant implications for the African Union and other continental organizations. The discovery that individual countries had been systematically prevented from developing strong inter-African relationships explained many of the difficulties that continental integration efforts had faced. The generational impact was particularly significant. Young Africans who had grown up believing that their continent was inherently prone to conflict and underdevelopment suddenly understood that many of these problems had external causes. This led to increased political engagement and demands for accountability from both African leaders and foreign powers. The religious and cultural dimensions of the plan were also revealed to be significant. Documents showed how religious divisions had been deliberately exacerbated and how traditional cultural practices had been either suppressed or manipulated to serve political purposes. The gender implications of the systematic control were profound. The documents revealed how women's traditional roles in African societies had been deliberately undermined as part of broader strategies to weaken social cohesion and increase dependency on external support. The environmental consequences of the 60-year plan were also becoming clear. The focus on resource extraction over sustainable development had created environmental problems that would take generations to address. Soil depletion, water contamination, and deforestation were all partly attributable to the systematic preference for short-term extraction over long-term sustainability. The discovery of the plan also revealed the extent to which African intellectual life had been shaped by external interests. Universities, research institutions, and even literary and artistic movements had been influenced by funding and support that came with implicit or explicit political conditions. The response from African diaspora communities around the world was particularly strong. Africans living in Europe and America organized protests and information campaigns to ensure that the revelations received widespread attention. Many diaspora Africans who had been considering permanent settlement abroad began making plans to return to Africa. The business community's reaction was complex. African entrepreneurs who had struggled to compete with European companies suddenly understood that they had been operating in systematically rigged markets. This led to demands for reparations and preferential treatment to compensate for decades of unfair competition. The technological transfer implications were significant. The revelation that dependency had been deliberately created led to massive investments in indigenous technological development. Countries that had been told they lacked the capacity for advanced technology began proving otherwise when given access to resources and support. The educational reforms that followed the revelations were comprehensive. Curricula that had emphasized European history and values were restructured to include African perspectives and achievements. New textbooks were written that presented African history as a story of achievement interrupted by foreign interference rather than a story of inherent failure. The linguistic implications were also important. The documents revealed how language policies had been used to prevent communication between African countries and to maintain connections to former colonial powers. This led to new emphasis on African languages and efforts to develop translation and communication systems that didn't require European lingua francas. The military and security implications of the revelations were carefully managed to avoid triggering conflicts. However, the discovery that many regional conflicts had been deliberately created or exacerbated led to new approaches to conflict resolution that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The international development community was forced to completely reassess its approaches and assumptions. Development theories that had attributed African underdevelopment to internal factors were revealed to be based on incomplete or deliberately distorted information. 25 years after the revelations, Historians would recognize this as the moment when Africa finally achieved genuine intellectual and psychological independence from colonial influence. The systematic nature of the control mechanisms, once exposed, could never again operate with the same effectiveness. The courage shown by Ibrahim Traoré and the other 5 leaders in revealing these documents, despite enormous personal and national risks, demonstrated that African leadership was finally ready to prioritize truth over convenience, sovereignty over dependency, and long-term liberation over short-term stability. The revelation of the 60-year plan proved that Africa's problems had never been inherent or inevitable. They had been systematically created and maintained by external powers for specific economic and political purposes. Once this truth was understood and accepted, the path to genuine solutions became possible for the first time in 6 decades. The secret agreement that Professor Diarra discovered had indeed explained why 6 countries had experienced similar patterns of instability on the same nights throughout their post-independence history. But more importantly, it had provided the roadmap for ensuring that such manipulation could never again control Africa's destiny. The personal costs of revealing the secret agreement were enormous for all involved. Professor Diarra, despite his academic tenure, faced threats from unknown sources and found his research funding mysteriously suspended. His family members studying abroad reported being approached by individuals offering lucrative opportunities in exchange for his silence. The elderly historian, however, remained resolute in his conviction that historical truth could not be suppressed for political convenience. Ibrahim Traoré's decision to reveal the documents placed his family under constant surveillance and threat. His children's schools received anonymous warnings about security concerns, forcing him to hire private protection for his family members. Intelligence reports suggested that multiple foreign services were monitoring his every move, preparing contingency plans for various scenarios including his removal from power. The psychological pressure on the 6 leaders was immense during the months following the revelation. Each faced internal opposition from officials who had benefited from the old system, external pressure from foreign governments, and the enormous responsibility of managing their country's transition to genuine independence while avoiding chaos. The technical authentication process for the documents was extensive and involved multiple international experts. Forensic analysis of the paper, ink, and typefaces confirmed that the documents were indeed from the 1960s. Handwriting analysis verified the signatures of French officials. Most importantly, cross-referencing with declassified documents from other archives confirmed the existence of the programs described in the secret agreement. The revelation prompted a comprehensive review of other colonial-era agreements across Africa and other former colonies. Similar patterns were discovered in documents relating to the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and other regions where former colonial powers had maintained disproportionate influence. This led to what historians would later call the Global Decolonization Documentation Project. The economic modeling that followed the revelations was staggering in its implications. Economists calculated that if the 6 countries had retained full control over their resources from independence, their combined GDP would have been approximately 15 times larger than it actually was in 2025. The systematic underpayment for resources, combined with inflated prices for imported goods and services, had created an almost perfect wealth extraction mechanism. The technological sovereignty movement that emerged from the revelations transformed African approaches to development. Rather than accepting dependency on foreign technology, African countries began investing heavily in indigenous research and development. Universities that had been focused on training students to work within foreign-controlled systems were restructured to develop African solutions to African problems. The cultural renaissance that followed was equally significant. African artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers began producing works that explicitly addressed the themes of manipulation and liberation revealed in the documents. This cultural production helped cement the psychological transformation from victimhood to agency that the revelations had triggered. The environmental justice movement that emerged was particularly powerful. The revelation that environmental degradation had been a deliberate strategy to prevent sustainable development led to comprehensive programs for ecological restoration. Countries that had been told they lacked the resources for environmental protection suddenly found ways to fund ambitious conservation and restoration projects. The linguistic liberation that followed addressed one of the most subtle but effective control mechanisms revealed in the documents. The systematic promotion of European languages at the expense of African languages had been designed to fragment African communication and maintain dependency on European cultural frameworks. New policies promoted African languages in education, government, and business while developing translation technologies to facilitate inter-African communication. The youth engagement that resulted from the revelations was unprecedented. Young Africans who had been planning to emigrate to Europe or America instead chose to remain and contribute to their country's transformation. Universities reported massive increases in enrollment in programs related to governance, economics, technology, and African studies. The women's empowerment movement that emerged was particularly significant. The documents had revealed how traditional African societies' relatively egalitarian gender relationships had been deliberately disrupted to create social instability. Women's organizations across the 6 countries began reclaiming traditional leadership roles while also demanding full participation in modern governance structures. The religious reconciliation efforts that followed addressed another divide-and-conquer strategy revealed in the documents. Religious leaders from different faiths worked together to counter the sectarian tensions that had been artificially amplified to prevent social cohesion. Interfaith councils were established to promote unity while respecting diversity. The agricultural revolution that followed the revelations transformed rural life across the 6 countries. The discovery that agricultural policies had been designed to create food dependency rather than food security led to massive investments in sustainable agriculture, farmer education, and rural infrastructure. Countries that had been net food importers began achieving food self-sufficiency within years. The healthcare transformation was equally dramatic. The revelation that healthcare systems had been deliberately kept dependent on foreign expertise and equipment led to crash programs for training indigenous medical professionals and developing local pharmaceutical industries. Traditional healing knowledge that had been systematically suppressed was integrated with modern medical practices. The financial sovereignty movement created entirely new economic relationships. Rather than accepting subordinate positions in global financial systems designed to extract value from Africa, the 6 countries developed alternative financial institutions and currencies. Regional development banks were established that prioritized African development over foreign profit. The diplomatic revolution that followed changed Africa's relationships with the entire world. No longer willing to accept subordinate positions in international organizations, African countries demanded equal treatment and began forming coalitions to advance African interests. The revelation of systematic manipulation gave African diplomats moral authority to challenge unfair international arrangements. The legal transformation included comprehensive reviews of all international agreements signed since independence. Contracts and treaties that had been signed under duress or without full understanding of their implications were renegotiated or abandoned. New legal frameworks were developed to prevent future manipulation while protecting genuine sovereignty. The intelligence and security transformations were necessary but carefully managed. The revelation that intelligence services had been penetrated by foreign agents led to comprehensive security reviews. However, rather than simply purging suspected collaborators, new systems were developed to ensure loyalty to national rather than foreign interests. The educational exchange programs that emerged created new forms of South-South cooperation. Rather than sending students exclusively to former colonial powers for advanced education, exchange programs were developed between African countries and with other regions of the Global South. This helped break the intellectual dependency that had been created through educational systems. The communication revolution that followed addressed one of the most subtle control mechanisms revealed in the documents. The systematic control of information flows through media ownership, telecommunications infrastructure, and internet connectivity had been designed to prevent Africans from communicating directly with each other. New communication systems were developed that bypassed European and American control points. The artistic and cultural preservation efforts that emerged addressed the systematic suppression of African cultural expression that had been part of the control strategy. Museums, cultural centers, and educational programs were established to preserve and promote African heritage while countering the cultural inferiority complexes that had been deliberately cultivated. The scientific research revolution that followed was perhaps most significant for long-term development. African countries that had been told they lacked the capacity for advanced scientific research began proving otherwise when given access to resources and support. Research institutions were established that focused on solving African problems using African knowledge and resources. The social healing processes that were necessary to address 60 years of systematic manipulation were complex and ongoing. Truth and reconciliation commissions were established not to address conflicts between Africans, but to acknowledge and heal the psychological damage caused by systematic external manipulation. These processes helped African societies understand that many of their conflicts had been artificially created or exacerbated. The regional integration efforts that followed succeeded where previous attempts had failed because they addressed the root causes of African disunity. Understanding that division had been deliberately created and maintained, African countries were finally able to develop genuine partnerships based on mutual interest rather than external pressure. 30 years after the revelation of the secret agreement, the transformation of the 6 countries was complete. They had developed from dependent client states into prosperous, sovereign nations that controlled their own resources and determined their own futures. The success of their transformation inspired similar movements across Africa and other regions of the global south. The legacy of Ibrahim Traoré's decision to reveal the documents extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. It had demonstrated that the relationship between former colonies and colonial powers could be fundamentally restructured based on equality rather than dominance, partnership rather than exploitation, and mutual respect rather than condescension. The revelation of the 60-year plan had proven that Africa's problems were neither inherent nor inevitable. They had been systematically created and maintained for specific political and economic purposes. Once this truth was understood and accepted, African countries could finally address their real challenges rather than wasting energy on artificially created conflicts and dependencies. The secret agreement that Professor Diarra discovered had explained not just why 6 countries had experienced similar patterns of instability, but how systematic manipulation could be overcome through truth, courage, and coordinated action. The liberation of the 6 countries had provided a template that other regions could follow in their own struggles for genuine independence and self-determination.